It is so interesting. There are quite a few other interviews that's also interesting. So one of which is Tucker Carlson was interviewing I think he called himself a historian,
Mm.
Daryl
Yeah.
Cooper.
Mm.
Yeah, and the reason I paid attention to this because the mainstream dismissed him. You know,
Mm.
they saying he's some kind of a weirdo or something. But then I got interested, so I look at that interview. It's a long interview, and in that interview, one part's very interesting. He said he thinks Winston Churchill is a villain. Now that's
Mm.
what got the CNN to dismiss him. I want to see your view. What's your take on Winston Churchill? Do you think he's a villain?
Right. The interesting thing about Churchill is that I was in Britain when he died, and I can remember his funeral. I was
Yeah.
there, and it was a huge event in Britain when it happened. And I was 4 years old, and about a year ago, I found the old footage, and I discovered to my astonishment that it was exactly as I remembered it. So, I have that memory about Churchill myself. Churchill is the giant figure of British 20th century history. And it must be said, there's two things to say about him. First of all, he was a racist imperialist. That there is absolutely no question at all. He came from the absolute core of the British aristocracy, this small ring of aristocratic families that controlled British power and British foreign policy from about the 17th century until very recently. He was absolutely one of them, and his mission, and he was the dominant figure in British foreign policy, in Britain, not just Britain, in Britain. He
Mhm.
was the leading, most important political figure in Britain from about 1920 until his death in about 1960. So, I mean, a period, 1965. So, a period of about 40, 50 years, he dominated British domestic and foreign policy. He's one of those people, even when he was out of power, because of his
Mhm.
family connections, because
Mhm.
of the force of personality that he had, because of his very real intelligence, he was always, even when he was out of government, he was always in power. That's an important thing to say. And his objective, his purpose was to preserve British power and to preserve the British Empire. Because through preserving British power and preserving the British Empire, he also preserved within Britain the ascendant position of his own class. Now that is what Churchill was all about. And along the way, of course, he was very racist. He
Yeah.
was
Yeah.
intensely socialist. He was, because, of course, I mean, the British Empire was an empire based on a conception of white supremacy. We must have never, brush that away or forget about it. So he was all of those things. And his major problem with Hitler and with Germany was the fact that he saw Germany as a potential rival to
Yeah.
Britain
Mhm.
and a threat to the survival of the empire
Mhm.
that Britain, was at the center of. So that's his motives. Those are his motivations. He was a brilliant orator. He was an incredibly skillful politician. He was an outstanding diplomat. Um, Undoubtedly the giant figure of British 20th century history. But that was what he was ultimately about. It was a reactionary, backward looking attempt to preserve an imperial system that was starting to collapse. And he prolonged it very well. He played, as some people have said, a weak hand with great skill. A person like this can still sometimes do real good. And by opposing Germany and Hitler when he did, and making sure that Britain opposed Germany and Hitler and Japan, he made sure that Britain was there with its empire and its resources, fighting Germany, German Nazism, and Japanese militarism at the right moment. So he's this person. When you say that when people say, did he save democracy, and was he a racist imperialist? Up to a certain point, he did save democracy, but he was also a racist imperialist. Was he a villain? Well, at some level, he was, because he was absolutely open about what he was trying to do, which was preserve the British Empire and the British system. But did he, at the same time, play a significant role in the 1940s in resisting forces which, if they'd succeeded, would undoubtedly have created a dark age? And by doing that, did he create new conditions in the world, in Europe, in China, across what we now call the global south, which led to the collapse of the empires, including the British Empire, that he had worked so hard to preserve? Yes, he did.
Yeah.
He did have that positive contribution at the same time. One of the things people don't know about Churchill is that towards the end of his life, he became increasingly depressed. He became very, very worried that Britain had become too closely allied to the United States. He felt that Britain urgently needed to regain its freedom of action. He tried to negotiate an end to the Cold War in the early 1950s, which was by then far too late. And towards the very end of his life, he was telling, when it was clear that British Empire was ending, he was telling everybody, in everything I have attempted, I have failed. So he went to his end believing himself to be a failure. So that is my view of Churchill. So, a complicated and difficult person to understand. But if you understand who he was and you look at his class and his origins, it's actually not that difficult.
That's pretty much more or less what Darren Cooper was saying. Now, one can say then that he is a defender of the British Empire, but ultimately he failed. One can say that because after World War II, Britain, the empire did collapse pretty much, right?
Yes.
But I guess at the time, what he was thinking, because Germany is this threat, he didn't like the Soviet Union either. So his thinking is to pull in United States to fight Germany and then get the Soviet and everybody, all these three big countries that potentially are the threat to the British Empire. They fight amongst themselves, and then they will be weakened. I think that's the idea, right? Isn't it?
Yes, I mean, it was. It was the kind of game that it needed a Churchill to play. I mean, he did have that enormous diplomatic skill and force of personality, but of course, when he was gone, and he lost power in the 1940s for a time, and in the 50s he was a significantly weakened figure, as of course Britain was. Then, of course, the Americans, the Soviets, began to think of their own plans. And of course, China emerged at that time, and India gained its independence. So the world eventually left him behind. He was a very bitter and unhappy man at the end of his life. If you read accounts of him at the end of his life, you realize what a sad and miserable person he had become. As I said, I have failed in everything that I sought to do.
Well, don't you think Britain is almost making the same mistake now? Because the idea for the Ukraine and the Russian war is to weaken Russia. But once the war is over and Russia emerges victorious, it will only make Russia stronger, just like World War II. After the war, because US and Russia, Soviet, they are the winners. So they emerge as more powerful, stronger, right? They replaced the British Empire. Basically, that's what happened. Isn't it? So they're making
This is
the same
absolutely
mistake.
correct. This is absolutely correct. Now, this is where, of course, we have the problem of the myth of Churchill. I mean, one of the things that Churchill did, of course, and he did it very, very systematically and very intentionally during the Second World War and after, he created a massive personality cult around himself. I mean, the British tell you they don't do personality cults. It's absolutely not the case. Margaret Thatcher had a kind of minor personality cult, but the big one is Churchill. I mean, your books, films, all sorts of things that make Churchill into this colossal, heroic figure. And what has happened in Britain is that the British political class, which remains very much under the spell of Churchill's personality, and it is, I mean, the extent to which the British talk about Churchill, especially conservative politicians talk about Churchill, is astonishing. The number of films that are still produced about him in Britain, the number of books that are still written about him in Britain, they, as I said, remain under the spell of Churchill. And they try to continue what they believe his policies to have been. Whereas the actual Churchill, one of the reasons he was such a formidable political figure was that he was very analytical. He was, by the way, very hardworking, very efficient manager. I mean, people always imagine that, because he spoke in a funny way and wore funny clothes, that he wasn't, but he was actually extremely hardworking, very efficient, very fact-based, very interested in understanding the leaders on the other side. He would have completely rejected the foreign policy that the British today are conducting. He would have said, this is completely wrong. What he would have wanted was something completely different. He would have said, look, the Russians have their interests in Eastern Europe. We can't resist them there. We need to have the Russians as a balance to the Americans. He always had some issues with the Americans, by the way, contrary to what many people think. We need them as a balance, and we've got to keep this balance there. The idea of winning a victory against the Russians, he would have said, is ridiculous. Yes. And he would have said exactly what you have said. The outcome of any such attempt is that it's going to make Russia much stronger, and it's going to make Russia hostile to us. That is, of this I have no doubt, because I've studied Churchill, but anybody who does history in Britain has to. I have absolutely no doubt that that is the approach that he would have taken. But of course, it is far too intelligent and sophisticated for the sort of people who run things in Britain today.
Yeah, they have a very simplistic view. Okay, it's good that the two of you fight because then you're weakened, right? But they have to learn their own history, But if somebody emerges as a victor, victorious, and then that country will be stronger. I mean, it has been proven repeatedly. If you look at the Korean War, I mean, before that, China was regarded as, oh, it's a poor country, even though it's big and with many people, but it's weak, It is after the Korean War, everybody was like, wow, that China actually can win against so many countries. This is a whole new China. That was the Korean War, right? That was not intended by China, but in the end, that was the result.
It's very interesting that you bring up the Korean War, because we now know that Churchill in private had great doubts about the wisdom of the Korean War. And when he became prime minister again in 1951, he basically wanted to find some means to bring the Korean War to an end. Because again, he thought that this was very misconceived and ill-judged. And this is the period in the early 50s when he was trying to end the Cold War, because he saw the Cold War as a trap for Britain, which was limiting its scope for political and diplomatic maneuver, and which, as a result, was facilitating the collapse of its empire, which, as I said, was what he wanted to preserve. He's a complicated man. He wrote massively, by the way. He's one of these people who was, and he spoke continuously. So it's actually not that difficult if you really want to research him to find out what he really was about and what he thought. But of course, many of the books he wrote were intended to promote his own personality cult, and did so very successfully. He wrote a massive multi-volume history of the Second World War, which should be avoided at all costs. It's all about Churchill and what a genius he was, and how he fought the Germans single-handed, and how everybody else played just side roles. And about China, he basically has nothing to say.